Hello. This is a paper I'm hoping to present at the Oxford Baha'i Studies Seminar on the 7th and 8th of August 21. It's a follow-up to a paper I presented at the previous Oxford Studies Seminar in December 2020. The two papers sharing the title Cohesion and Leadership in the Babi and Baha'i Religions, Some Sociological Considerations. I'll give the link below to the first paper. As I stated in the earlier paper, it's not uncommon for religious and other social movements to fracture over time into competing subgroups, split over differences of belief or leadership or along ethnic or national lines, with religious movements being particularly susceptible to such fission. To remain as a single movement, continuing cohesion of some sort is required. Of course, decentralized movements can be very successful, as per modern Pentecostalism, but they are by their very nature localized and diverse, a loose confederation of allied groups rather than a unified movement. But in the Babi and Baha'i cases considered here, this was not considered to be an option. Rather, both movements emphasized the extraordinary status of a single charismatic leader and had an ideal of a single unified movement. So, why do some movements retain their unity whilst others fracture? Historically, one of the major means of creating and maintaining cohesion has been coercion, examples of which abound in both religious and political history, as with the use of control mechanisms designed to ensure members' continuing membership and the outlawing or even elimination of rivals and dissidents. However, whilst cohesion based on coercion may become embedded in tradition and thus continue over time, it's inherently fragile, for when the coercion is removed, the basis for cohesion is lost, and divisions may then readily develop. What then are the bases for continuing cohesion without coercion? I would suggest two sociological mechanisms which can play a major role in creating and sustaining cohesion. First of all, religious motifs, and secondly, resource mobilization. Note that the presence of these mechanisms doesn't necessarily preclude the use of control mechanisms in a particular movement, although their presence may well lessen its use. I discussed the first of these two mechanisms in the previous paper, pointing to the major role of what I've termed the polar motif, that is, the deep-seated conviction that there must always be an authoritative supreme leader who acts as an intermediary with the sacred in some way. Sacred, sociologically, it's linked to an eagerness to follow a succession of those perceived as charismatic leaders. This motif was a crucial part of the Sheikhi movement, out of which Babism first emerged, and has remained a vital part of Babi and Baha'i thinking ever since. Thus, the central role of the Bab, both as the claimed successor to the Sheikhi masters and later as the promised Messiah, and more generally amongst a wider circle of people as a perceived holy man. Notably, whilst the crises consequent on his confinement in the remote fortresses of Azerbaijan and his later execution threatened the cohesion of the movement, the Babi response was to seek further charismatic guidance, indicating the continuing importance of the polar motif. More straightforwardly, during the Baha'i period, the polar motif contributed powerfully to the relatively smooth series of successions to leadership, from Baha'u'llah to Abdul Baha, and then on to Shoghi Effendi, the Hands of the Cause acting as custodians, and finally the Universal House of Justice. The present paper deals with the second sociological mechanism I identified, that is effective resource mobilization, a topic I've previously discussed in both an ancient academic paper and a recent webinar. Again, I'll give the links below. Cohesion in the Babi movement. The situation for the Babis was quite different from that of their Baha'i successors, in large part because of the extremely turbulent experience of their short-lived movement, with its violent conflicts and eventual bloody suppression by the Iranian state. Even without external threat, however, the movement never achieved the level of cohesion and coordination that were to be attained by the Baha'is. Undoubtedly, there were logistical factors involved here. Iran was, and is, a vast country, and in the mid-19th century the Babis had no access to the technologies of printing, telegraph, steamships, and railways, later so expertly employed by the Baha'is. To travel from the major Babi missionary center in Mashhad in the northeast to Tabriz in the northwest, for example, would have entailed a journey of over 1,500 kilometers on pre-modern roads, even before the Babi pilgrim or courier journeyed on from Tabriz to the Bab's actual places of imprisonment in the remote fortresses of Marku and Chehrik. Nevertheless, we can note that some of the elements later employed by the Baha'is to maintain a communication network were also attempted by the Babis, although with less success. The Bab himself being attended by a personal secretary to transcribe his writings, and there being Babi couriers and copyists to later copy and distribute them. There may have been an additional ideological factor involved, however, in terms of a less unified message than that later propagated by the Baha'is. Thus, we know that the Babis themselves had varying understandings of the actual status of the Bab and of the implications of his proclamation and teachings. There appear to have been several instances of tensions developing between leading disciples over these matters, of which the most famous is the still rather shadowy Conference of Badasht in 1848, in which these tensions appear to have threatened to lead to violence between Babi factions, as well as reports of unspecified antinomian activity by some of its participants, and of severe condemnation by more conservative Babi leaders who were not present. Again, during the Bab's imprisonment in the remote northwest, several, and possibly rival, charismas were attributed to various of the Babi leaders, notably Mullah Hussein, Qudus, and Tahareh, all three of whom were held by at least some of the Babis to share in the Bab status as the promised Qa'im, what the American sociologist Peter Berger referred to as a charismatic field. We may also note the growing factionalism that beset the movement after the Bab's execution, with a plethora of rival individuals advancing claims to leadership and or theophanic status. Now let's turn to cohesion in the Baha'i movement. The very orderly successions to Baha'i leadership after the death of Baha'u'llah stand in marked contrast to the divisions which beset the Babis. Cohesion and unity were much easier to maintain in the Baha'i movement than in Babism, later gaining strong ideological support through the notion of the Baha'i Covenant, under which an authoritative leadership succession was institutionalized, with a stress on loyalty to each new leader as an essential part of membership, and strong disloyalty leading to expulsion from the community, in sociological terms, a control mechanism. It is striking, from a sociological point of view, that even prior to 1892, when allegiance to the Baha'i cause is likely to have been primarily motivated by a sense of personal loyalty to Baha'u'llah, there were already organizational mechanisms in place to strengthen and enhance effective movement coordination and cohesion. Such movement mechanisms were necessitated by the basic logistics of the emerging movement, with Baha'u'llah physically distant in various parts of the Ottoman Empire from the mass of his followers in Iran. The direct distance from Akka in Ottoman Syria, for example, Baha'u'llah's final region of exile, to Kermanshah, the nearest western Iranian town, was over 1,300 kilometers, largely across desert. Couriers and pilgrims would take longer and more circuitous routes. To meet the logistical challenges involved, a network of couriers was developed to convey Baha'u'llah's writings, transcribed by those who functioned as his own secretariat, to his followers in Iran and elsewhere, including those who would make further copies of them and so distribute them to a wider circle of believers. The same couriers would bring back messages from the followers. Baha'i agents were also appointed in various cities along the way to oversee and sometimes help and direct the often arduous journeys of those who wanted to visit Baha'u'llah in person. Again, the Baha'is were quick to use the new British telegraph system to convey messages across Iran and the newly developing networks of steamer services and railways to ease their travels to and from their chief. Alongside effective organizational mechanisms of coordination, cohesion was also maintained by there being a unitary Baha'i message. Individual Baha'is might have their own understanding of Baha'u'llah's station and which of his teachings they most valued, but there was no ambiguity about the centrality of Baha'u'llah and his writings. This centrality was enhanced by the Baha'is taking early advantage of the possibilities of printing their books and other literature. Whilst literature could still be hand-copied in Iran, printing in the religion's original homeland could not be developed. But after the Baha'is established an outpost in Bombay, in British India, they soon internationalized this aspect of their endeavors and then smuggled the printed works into Iran to be distributed both to believers and possible inquirers. This was an additional factor, making it much easier to maintain a unity of message than it had been for the Babis. At a local level, the Baha'is also quickly developed an effective network of loyal missionary teachers who could act as Baha'u'llah's lieutenants in Iran. These men, mostly converted Shi'i clerics, were able to provide the Baha'is with both leadership within Iran and further afield, as well as authoritative statements of the Baha'i teachings, and, as they traveled from one local Baha'i group to another, lay the basis for a developing sense of national Iranian Baha'i identity. After 1892, these developments provided a strong basis for subsequent Baha'i cohesion, despite the challenges of leadership successions and major geocultural shifts, as the range of Baha'i adherents was progressively enlarged, initially to include active Baha'i groups in North America and Europe from the 1890s, and later to poorer and predominantly rural populations in the global south from the 1950s. Although the succession to leadership of Baha'u'llah's eldest son, Abdul-Baha, in 1892 was challenged by his half-brother, Muhammad Ali, almost all of the Baha'is accepted the succession, presumably because of a mixture of sentiments, including primogeniture, Abdul-Baha's widely known existing prominence within the movement, and Baha'u'llah's written statement of appointment. Although there was henceforth a new emphasis on the covenant doctrine and limited use of the control mechanism of expulsion from the movement of those deemed to have rebelled against it, positive sentiments of loyalty appear to have been the main factor in securing continued Baha'i solidarity. During Abdul-Baha's period of leadership from 1892 to 1921, further Baha'i printing centers were established in Cairo and Ashgabat, as well as in the West, and there were even some printed works produced in Tehran using the jellygraph system. Significantly, he also developed a reviewing system to approve published Baha'i literature, which, together with the increasing availability of printed materials, resulted in the establishment of canonical and authoritative scripture as a fixed text, accessible to every literate believer, and implemented a system of elected local councils referred to by Baha'u'llah to manage community affairs. Eventually, these were termed spiritual assemblies, these bodies becoming a major element in creating a flexible but coordinated network, maintaining cohesion across an increasingly widespread movement. Again, Abdu'l-Baha oversaw the expansion of the Baha'i movement to the West and the successful integration of these new Baha'is into what now became a genuinely culturally diverse and international movement. The following leadership transitions to Shoghi Effendi, the Hands of the Cause, and the Universal House of Justice were all relatively uneventful and were accepted by the overwhelming majority of Baha'is. In each case, the existing patterns of logistical coordination with a continuing series of central focal points and a unified Baha'i message were maintained, whilst the challenges from small groups of dissident Baha'is, who were then expelled from the faith as covenant breakers, were ineffectual. The new age of the internet from the 1990s doesn't appear to have significantly changed this situation, as with the earlier embrace of 19th century communication and transportation technologies, the Baha'is have readily embraced the online world, both for internal coordination and the presentation of their beliefs to the outside world. This would be a useful topic for someone to do future research on. Thank you for listening. Many thanks also to my patrons for their support with my YouTube channel. And if you want, you're very welcome to support my channel. Like, comment, and share the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. And I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Have a good day.